Okay. So the first question is here, what is meant by a data type? Is it data type? What exactly mean by data type and where we use it? Right? So if you have a little bit of programming knowledge, then you might be knowing what is meant by data type. But if you don't have, still you can understand by name of the data type, right? So what is the data type exactly? The name itself says the type of the data which we have to apply, or the type of the data which a field should accept or which a variable should accept. Okay. Now let's take a form here. When I take an user form, okay. So now let me do one thing. Internet has got some problem. Okay, so internet has got some problem. I will open it. When I have an user form, you will be having like this. Okay, I have a first name, and you have a last name, and you will be having a mobile number and middle name, and you will be having the date of birth field and alternate email and mobile number. So like this, age, all these are the fields that you will be having there. Then when you take that form, take first name and last name. What kind of values that we enter? Alpha or alphanumeric. That's a string, right? And take age field. What value that you enter? It must be a numeric. Can you enter alpha characters in that? No. When you take mobile number, must be a numeric. No alpha characters and all. Take date of birth, must be a date field. No other things. And when you take a checkbox, there will be some checkbox. Then just on or off. That means Boolean it is. Right? True or false. Okay, if you said true, that means you are selecting it. If you said to false, then you are unselecting it. No other values. Right? These are the data types, in fact. So what kind of data that particular field should allow? So internally, when it comes to the programs, then every field will be associated by a variable internally. So based on the type of the value that variable accepts, the same value will be passed to the field. Right? So ultimately what I mean to say here, data type is the type of the data or the kind of the data what a variable should allow, or what a field should allow, or should accept it. That's what the data type meant for. Then when it comes to the other languages like C# or Java or other languages, then we have various data types. Each one, whatever I have told, is a data type. String is one data type, or date is one data type, and a Boolean is one data type, object is one data type, right? And numeric, not numeric is a data type here. Numeric has got various like integer, byte, few things are there, depends on the range of the number. Okay, so each one is one data type here, and whenever you define a variable, whenever you create a variable in the program, then you must have to specify the type of that variable. Like say, okay, I'm defining this variable at only string value. Okay, this variable type is string, so that I can, anyone can pass only the string value here. Okay, I'm defining a variable, the type of this variable is numeric, so only numeric value should be passed to this. Or I'm defining a variable, the variable is date, so only date values can be passed, like that. So every variable that whatever we define, then you must have to specify the data type. That means what kind of data that has to be passed to the variable. You got what I'm saying? But when it comes to the VB script, it is little different compared with other languages. In VB script, it is little different. Then what makes the difference here is, in VB script, we have only one data type. We have only one data type. That's called variant. Remember, this is important. Okay, write down. The interview question is, what is variant, or what is the data types in VB script? Okay, so what is what is the data type in VBScript or what is variant. Okay. So in VBScript we have only one data type, nothing but we call it as a variant type. That's a default type of the variable in VBScript. What exactly this variant is? Variant is nothing but the combination of all the data types that whatever I told now. It's a string, a date, or the byte, integer, or long. All these are the numeric data types internally. Object, empty, null. So the combination of all these data types, variant. Okay. So when a variable is variant, again that's a default type. When the variable is variant, that variable will allow any kind of value. Whatever the value that you pass, then variable, there is no restriction. Say that you have to pass only this kind of value. If you pass a string value, variable takes it. Or if you pass a date value, variable takes it. If you pass a boolean value to the same variable, it takes. Okay? Yeah. So that's what the variant means for. But this is one of the advantage in the VBScript. Say I don't need to remember what all these data types and all. I don't need to specify. So tomorrow, if the value type is changed, then I don't need to do any change and all because it allows any kind of value for me. But this is one of the drawback too. The drawback is, now let's go back to the same form. I have defined a date of birth field. Now I consider that field as a variant. If I consider that field as a variant, then what happens? It allows any kind of value. But should it? It should not. If it accepts, then obviously my validation and all goes wrong. As per my requirement, that field accepts to only the date type. No other type of value should be accepted. If that is the case, then variant is not the right thing for, or variant is not the right data type for that particular field. Right? So when you define a variable as variant, in certain situations, this is what happens. So sometimes I must have to tell my script saying that, hey, if user tries to provide a different type of value for this particular context or in this particular context in this script for this variable, only this kind of value has to be taken. If user tries to provide a different type of value, okay, then don't accept them. Immediately throw the error to the user saying that, okay, so this value cannot be taken because the type is little different here, type is different here. Got what I'm saying? But when you keep the variable with the default type defined by VBScript, by default, as soon as you define the variable, by default it will be variant only. Variant only. But in this context, what you can do is, what they have done is, when they are defining the VBScript, they thought of the same kind of situations. Then they have given the subtypes for the variant. Main type is variant. Only type is variant here, the main type. But variant can be, converted into subtypes. Like whatever we discussed, the string, boolean, all those are the subtypes. Whereas in other programming language, those are the main types of the variables, where in VBScript, those are the subtypes. But it's not mandated to use subtypes, only depends on the situation. Remember, again, you can't directly define the variable with the subtype. You can't directly define the variable with the subtype. First, variable will be variant by default. Then later variant can be converted into subtype. We have to utilize some functions for that to convert. Okay. So this is the data type. In VBScript we have only one data type, that is called variant, and variant is nothing but the combination of all the data types. That is nothing but combination of all the data types. Okay. Then let's see the simple example. First let me open this. Sometimes I will be opening with just to show how the data types and how it makes the difference from other language to VBScript. Just let it be. Let it get open. Okay, fine here. So if you look at this variable, right? First name, whatever I have defined here. So how I have defined? Say string and first name. What does it mean? Okay, that variable should take only the string value. The type of the variable is string. And see, if I assign a string value here, no error has been taken. It's just capturing that. But if I assign value, if you see that, cannot implicitly convert type into string. The reason because that variable type is a string. I have defined when I declare that variable is declared as string, but the value which I assign to that is a numeric value. So where the numeric value cannot be converted into string directly, because the variable takes only the string type. That's what happens in other languages. So whenever you define a variable, you must have to specify, okay, what kind of values we are going to store in those variables, or what kind of values that we are going to pass, string or boolean or date, or it's a date time, or like that. There are different types that we do have. But whereas same thing when I do it in VB script, string first name equals to so something, I'm just defining. So let me do one thing. I'm just creating. Whenever you want to execute this program, right, I'll tell you why I am doing this. You must have to save this. You can still execute directly from here by clicking on start, but VBS Edit is not freeware completely. It's a commercial, but freeware which never gets expired. Okay, so but I'll tell you why I'm saving this and executing again. Save VB script. If you directly run from here, right, the program, it will, how much time it is taking? 3 seconds. But every time when you run, the 1 second will be keep increasing. Okay, 1 second will be keep increasing. Then, so if you run 10 times, then 10th time, right, it will say 10 seconds, it will wait, and then it will start executing. So execution will be delayed. That's the reason what you can do is save that file. Okay, so the extension for VB script file is VBS.VBS. That is an executable file. And even when you write the program in Notepad, then you can save that file as an VBS file and go to the source where you have saved the file. You double click on that. VBS is an executable file. Okay. So how do you execute the VB script program and all, right? So write the program here in the VBS edit, then save this file, and then go to the source where you have saved that. You just run the file. Double click on it. So that program will be executed. So whenever you do any changes, you do the change here and then save this and run there. Okay, so that's how we can run the VBS file. So it's a .vbs and executable file. Okay, now let's see what happened. I defined the variable in the same way. I'm just trying to say the variable is string, the first name. But what it is showing, wrong number of arguments or invalid property assigned. So it's not able to identify that string as a type, data type. So it is throwing a different error here. Actually, string is one of the inbuilt function which we have for a different purpose, not to define the data type, and for a different purpose they have given the function. So Here, cannot declare the variable by saying string, or you cannot declare the variable by saying date, or you cannot declare the variable, by using any other data type. Okay, so that means you cannot define the variables by default with any specific type of the data. Then, as I told, the variable is variant by default, right? How can I define the variable with a variant type? Remember, you never specify the data type as variant in the VB script. By default, as soon as you declare the variable, type will become as variant only. Now the question is here, we are talking more about variables, defining the variables and all. Then how I can define the variables? In other languages, how to define the variable? Like data type, variable name. So and so data type, variable name. But in VB script, it is little different. You don't need to specify the data type, right? So I cannot specify string variable or date variable or boolean variable. I can never specify that. But the reason because it's variant by default, only one type. Then how can you define the variable or how can you declare the variable in VB script is, there are various ways to declare the variable. There are 4 statements available to declare the variables. Now write down declaring the variables. But before going to the declaration, first let us understand what is meant by a variable. While discussing about data type, we discussed about variables. Then it's a variable should allow the value or this kind of value and all. What exactly what is the exact meaning of a variable and why we need to use the variables in the programs? That is the first question that we get. Then we will go to the question how we can declare and how we can use the variables. So the first question is, what exactly meant by a variable? Variable never performs the operation. Variable never performs the operation. Okay, so yeah, store the value. That is right. But okay, so the question followed like this. Why do you need to store? Store the values is right. Variable is just a memory where we can store the values temporarily. Fine, that is right answer. Okay, the next question is, why do I need to store? Values can be? We can change the values. But I can directly pass the value to the program and then I can change the value there, right? Why should I store it in a variable and then pass to the program?
If you change in a variable, it will change for whole program, wherever they are using that variable.
Okay. So, yeah. Not to perform the action again. Let's say, okay, take a scenario. Now, I'll take an end-to-end flow. Let's take, we were discussing more on ERP and all, right? So let's take that flow. I'm creating a purchase order. Okay? Then when I'm creating a purchase order, end-to-end, maybe till the supplier invoice I'm creating. Then first I need to create a purchase order. There are a lot of fields. First I navigate to the purchase order. Then I enter the header details of the purchase order. A lot of things are there. From which supplier and requested date, ordered date, and then the currency. All this I enter. Lot of fields are there. And again, items. What and all the items I'm ordering. Then all the items should be mapped to the purchase order. Once that is done, then I need to continue with the approval flow. Okay, so I need to send for approval. Then once it is approved, then I need to transfer to the supplier. And then once I receive the order, then I have to close the purchase order and then I need to generate the supplier invoice based on the purchase order here. What purchase order has the unique ID. Whatever the purchase order is generated there, when I create the purchase order, whatever the ID generated for that purchase order, I need to take that ID and I need to pass to the supplier invoice. The same. But for every execution, there will be one new purchase order will be creating, not the same purchase order. That will be created only at the execution time. You cannot predict which order will be generated. You got what I am saying? Now, when you take this end-to-end flow, what happens here? Once I execute, once I create the purchase order, there will be one ID generated. There will be one ID generated. What I have to do with that ID? I need to store that ID. I need to capture that ID, and then after the process completed, the receiving order, everything, then I need, once I come to the supplier invoice, the same purchase order, whatever generated there, the same ID has to be passed to the supplier invoice here. If you pass the value directly in the code here, what happens if you directly pass the value directly in the code? Since the values keep changing, then every time you have to come to the supplier invoice, you need to update the value. But to update that value, then we don't know which ID is generating, right? During runtime, I will not have any control on the program to update the values and all. Then what I should do here? Instead of directly writing the value there, once the ID is generated, I will ask my script, say capture this ID, I will create a memory here, store this ID in this memory, and then in the supplier invoice, while writing the program for supplier invoice, I'll tell that, okay, I'm not directly giving you the value here, which value to be taken, then I already created a memory, then the value will be stored in that memory, take the value from that memory. So once the purchase order is created, whatever the value updated in that memory, the same value will be passed to the supplier invoice. Right? So ultimately the values keep changing. But when the value is changing, then if you directly write the value in the program, then there is a lot of maintenance work. It has to be. So that's the reason whenever the values are keep changing, instead of directly writing the value in the program, what you do is just create one memory and store the value in that memory. Then whenever you want to take the value or whenever you want to use the value, instead of referring the value directly, you refer to the memory. You got what I'm saying? Then this memory is nothing but the variable. So one of the situation where you must have to use the variable is when you want to pass the values from a program, one piece of code to another piece of code, or one block of code to another block of code, where using the variable is necessary. Okay, that is one situation. The second situation is, now assume that I'm storing certain, I'm mapping certain items, right? Then the same item I need to map or I need to use in multiple times. While creating the purchase order, same item name I have to pass there for the purchase order creation. While receiving the order, the same item has to be passed there. While checking for the inventory, the same item name should be passed to that program. And while creating supplier invoice, the same item name has to be passed to the supplier invoice as well. That means the same value I'm using multiple times in one program. More than 3 or 4 times I'm using. Getting what I'm saying here? Now, if I directly pass the value in all these places in my program, if I directly write the value, what happens? One time it works fine, but next time, I may not work with the same item. That item might be expired and I will have to pass new item there. What should I do? If I want to use new item, first I need to find out in what and all the lines I have written that item name. Then I have to go to each and every line and do the update. Remove that old item name and write a new item name. This is just 3 times I have written. Maybe I might have written more, maybe 15 times or 20 times. How much time it takes? Again, this will lead to lot of maintenance work. Remember, when we do the automation or when we do the program, right, 20% of the work goes for script writing, 80% of the time goes for maintenance in the reality. 20% of the projects will be new development and 80% of the projects will be maintenance. If this takes more time, every time, it will kill. For every execution, it kills lot of time. It takes lot of time for me. This is the drawback of directly writing the value in the program. What should be done in this case? What I will do is, again, I will create a memory here. Whatever the value that I need to reuse, I just store the value in the memory. In the beginning itself, I will create the memory. Then whenever I want to use the value, I don't take the value wherever I want. I just refer to this memory. I'll say, okay, whenever I want this value, instead of saying use this value, okay, value is stored in this memory, take from there. If I want to use the value 10 times, I will just refer to that memory 10 times. Tomorrow if the value gets changed, I don't need to go and change it in 10 times, change in all those places. What I do, I'll just come to the memory, I will update the value here. When I run the script, whatever the value is stored in that memory, the same value will be taken. This reduces maintenance work for me. Only one time change. Even though the same value used multiple times, but still I don't need to change all the times. I can just update only once. So if the value is reused and if the value gets changed every time, instead of directly passing the value in the code, then you store the value in the memory first and then use it. Use the memory in the program. That memory is nothing but a variable again. So one is when you want to pass the values from one piece of code to another piece of code, or whenever you want to store the values temporarily to use it in later part of the code, one thing. Second one is if the values are reused and if the values are gets changing every time, so instead of passing those values directly in the program, because when I directly pass the values in the program, that's called hard coding. Okay, that's called hard coding. When you hard code the values in the program, whenever the value gets changed, it leads to a lot of maintenance work. It takes a lot of time for me to update those values every time in the program. First I need to find out where exactly in which line of code I have used this value, and then I need to update. So to avoid this maintenance work, then what we do is the values which keeps changing, then I will store those values in the memory first and I will refer to the memory. So whenever the value gets changed and all, I don't need to update anything in the program. I will just go into the memory and update the value. So only the latest value will be taken. You got? So this memory is nothing but the variable. Then why we use the variable? What is the variable? A variable is nothing but a memory. A variable is nothing but a memory where we can store the values, and why we store the values to use them in later part of the code. Then why exactly we need to use the variables? Because some of the values will be dynamic, some of the values will be reused, and some of the values will be generated only at runtime. I need to pass from one place to another place. Got what I am saying? So this is, and when you write the program, this is one of the mandatory thing that we follow. Okay, so no matter whatever the program that you write it in C#, you write it in Java, or you write it in VB script, or you write it. These concepts are generic to the automation, generic to the program. It's not specific to a particular language. This variables concept and all. But way of declaring is vary from one language to another language. But the purpose of the variable is common everywhere. Variable is just a memory where we can store the values, and why? Because of those reasons. Now the question is, in C# we just saw how we can declare the variables. We just define the data type and we give the name of the variable. But in VB script, as I told, you can't define that data type directly there, and its default is variant. Now how I can declare the variable in VB script? Write down. So there are 3 statements available in VB script. In fact 4 statements, but one of the statement we don't use every time. You don't just write down. Then those 4 statements are, one is dim, second one is public, third one is private, and fourth one is constant, CONST. Okay, so there are 4 statements available. The difference between these are, generally dim is a global. Dim is a global. That means, that is whenever we declare the variable in a global way, or that is a globalized format. Dim stands for dimension. Dim stands for dimension usually. There is no difference between dim and public. Okay, so dim is a standard way to declare. But the real thing that what we need to understand here is difference between public and private. Okay, so there is no much difference between dim and public. Okay, but there is a difference between public and private. Those are just the generic English terms. You know the meaning of what is meant by public and what is meant by a private. When I say something is private, it's my private property. Then only I can use it. No others will be able to use it. But when I say something is a public property, then everybody will be able to use it. Let's make, the same thing here. When I say a variable is a public variable, now in the program whatever we write, it won't make any difference public and private. But as I told yesterday, so we'll be discussing about some class objects, right? So we'll be having class objects. Then inside each class we may declare a lot of variables and all. If you declare a variable with public in one of the class, now assume that I have class A, class B. Class A does few things and class B will do some other things. Now in class A I will write some procedures or I will write some programs and all. The variable, whatever the variable I am using in class A, the same variable I need to use it in class B also. In such case, the variable should be a public variable because the variable which I declared in class A should be accessible by class B. Okay, the variable which I declared in class A should be accessible by class B or some other classes. So in such cases, you must have to define the variable with public. So when I say the public and so on so variable, that means the variable is not restricted to only this class and that variable can be accessible by some other classes. That's a public. But when I say private, a variable is a private variable, then this variable is allowed within this class only, or this variable can be used within this class and no other class object can use this variable. So when you make a variable as public, then that variable is a public property. That means okay, some other class objects can use that variable. When you make a variable as a private, then other classes cannot access this particular variable. So this is what the difference between public and private. But we are not writing any class objects for now, so that public and private and dim, all three will work in the same way. Because when you write the class objects, then only it makes the difference. But we are not writing any class objects for now, that will be coming at the end. So then we will discuss about public and private. For now, we can leave the public and private. And the difference between dim and constant or other variables, other types is constant is little different here. By default, a variable is dynamic, which means once you declare a variable, you can give any kind of value to the variable. At the same time, you can update the variable value at any time. Initially, this is the value. After some piece of code, after executing, depends on the condition, then the variable value will be updated, or the value will be updated in the application. I need to take the updated value into the same variable. After some time, again the value gets updated. Then I need to store the updated value in the same variable. That means I need to overwrite the values. When you declare a variable by using dim or public or private, then the variables are dynamic here. You can update the variable values at any time. There is no restriction saying that the value whatever I am giving now, the same value should be throughout. Whatever the value I give in the beginning of the code, then throughout the program, it has to be same value. Nothing like that. The variable values are dynamic when you use dim or public or private. But in certain situations, The value whatever I give in the beginning of the program, the same value should be carried throughout. Then in between, the variable should not get updated with any other value, because if the variable value gets updated, maybe some other functions may get affected. So the variable value should be constant here. For that particular execution, variable value, whatever the value that I am given in the beginning, then the variable value should be constant throughout. The value should not get changed. So if you want to make the variable as constant, then you must have to declare the variable by using that fourth statement, constant statement. So constant is used to make the variable as constant. That's it. Okay. Now let us see how we can use those statements, how we can declare the variable and all. Add a small note below. Add just a small note. In VB script, declaration of variable is not mandatory. I'll come back to this point in some time. Declaration of a variable is not mandatory. In VB script, declaration of a variable is not mandatory. Everything is temporary here. Everything is temporary. Only for that execution. Every time it will, once variable is declared, it creates the memory. Once the execution is completed, it will erase the memory. Okay? Execution is completed. Okay, fine. I will come to that note in some time. So how do you declare the variables by using dim statement is, just say dim I'm just using some variables here. And again, as I told, variable names are not case sensitive here. You can declare it in any case. But only thing is, when you are writing the programs and all, you have to follow some standards. Okay? So as per the standard, always the variable name should be in sentence case or should be in camel case, we call it as. That means the first letter will be in uppercase and remaining will be lowercase, like that. Okay? So I mean, that's a standard. It's not necessary, but that's just a standard, that's it. And now, in other languages we use semicolon, right? But in VBScript don't use the semicolon. But when you are writing for web development, when you are writing inside the HTML code, when you are interpreting with HTML code, semicolon can be used. But in normal VBScript, when you are writing for automation, don't use semicolons at the end of the line. That's not the syntax for VBScript. Many people do this mistake when people come from different, the programming knowledge background, right? That's what they do. The other languages, Java, C# and all, we write the semicolon at the end. To say that is end of the statement, but so we never use semicolon here. Don't write them. Then dim last name. Like, okay, every variable, whatever you have, every variable you can declare in one line. But assume I have 200 variables to be used. Maybe that variables are globally I'm making, or in many scripts I'm using. If you declare each variable in one line, then it will take huge amount of lines, right? So it's not necessary that each variable should be declared in single line. You can declare multiple variables in same line. How that can be done is, when you have more amount of variables, dim variable 1, comma, variable 2, comma, variable 3, comma, variable 4. So like this, each variable for one line, one dim statement. You should not say dim variable 1, comma, dim variable 2, comma, dim variable. In the same line, that statement should not be repeated, remember. For one line, only one statement. Dim space variable 1, comma, variable 2, comma, variable 3, comma, variable 4, comma 4, like that. So a number of variables in the same line you can. But once you move to the next line, say, okay, in the first line I have declared enough amount of variables. There is no limit. You can just continue with a number of variables. But you say, okay, 10 variables I have declared in one line. Then if you move to the next line, then you must have to write dim or public or private, anything. Good. So this is how generally we declare. But if I declare that variable, if I declare the variable, did I say that variable as string, or did I say that variable as numeric? No. But did I say the variable as variant? I didn't even say. I just declared the variable with dim. When you declare the variable with any of this, maybe whatever the statement you use, dim or public or private, any statement you use, but by default the variable type will be set as variant only. Okay, by default the variable set as type is set as variant. So you can assign any kind of value. Now let's say, how do you assign the value? Once I declare that variable, I'll say like this: first name equals to some test value. What I am doing here, what kind of value it is? That is a string value. Whatever the value you give within double quote, right? So that will be treated as a string. Every value which is given within double quote will be treated as a string. Okay? Now, let me do one thing. Let me run the program. 1 minute. I'm not using any message box or any, nothing will be displayed. But in case if there is any error, if the variable is not accepting, it should throw the error to me. What I'm doing? So this is how the VBS file will be looking like. Once you save it, come to the folder where you have saved it and just double click it. Just it's executed, but no output, nothing, because I'm not taking any output or anything. And no error also. When there is no error, what does it mean? Whatever the program that we have written, script accepted it. So when I pass a string value to that, it's accepted. Same thing now what I will do is, what I am doing this time, I am passing some numeric value. No error, it's accepting still. Then, for better understanding, let me use something, message box. Message box is nothing but, it's one of the function for us, which displays the value during execution for us. Whatever the value that we pass to the message box, during runtime, it appears to us and then we can see what is the value. So I'm saying, message box first name means whatever the value stored in the first name, display that value to me. 1 minute, spelling mistake. So whatever the value stored in that first name, it is showing. Then if I pass date value, so generally date values will be passed within as symbol, generally, okay? And also right, it is accepting date value also. Accepting that value as well. No error is being thrown. So that means whatever the value I am passing to that variable is accepting it. It is not throwing any error saying that, hey, okay, you are passing a boolean value, but I can't accept it. I can accept only string value. Is it showing? No. That's what the variant means for. Any value, whatever the value you pass to that variable will accept it when it is variant. But as I told, there are certain situations where the variable must accept only specific kind of value. Variable has to accept only a specific kind of value. No other values should accept. Now assume that date of birth field. Now when I say date of birth field here, equal to, so I just given the variable name as date of birth, right? But it doesn't mean that when I given the variable name, it has to accept only that type. Variable remain variant only. Now what I'm doing here is I'm passing a string value. One minute. So by default, a variable contains an empty value. That's the reason even I did not give any value to that variable, it is showing the empty. It is accepting string value. Even though the name is given as DOV, just by name of the variable, it cannot check the type. But that is wrong, right? When I pass a string value, it should not accept. What should we do now? If you write the same thing in your program, then your program will be failed. Validation will be failed there. Then what you need to do is, what they have done first is, they have created some subtypes for the variant. Then, as I told again, you cannot directly declare the variable with subtype and variant. Once you declare the variable and once it is initiated, remember, once the value is passed, then you convert it into subtype. If you have passed a value, if you passed a different value, then while converting, it will fail. Now that has to be date value, right? DOB should accept only date value. Now once I pass the value, what I will do is I will convert into date type. If you have passed only the date value there, it will accept. If you passed a wrong value there, then it will throw the error. Now let's see. Don't get confused here. There are some functions which we need to use for conversion, but inbuilt functions is one of the concept for us. There we are going to discuss in detail, but just understand only the concept. Okay, here. Don't understand or don't, if you don't understand the function, what I use, message box I used, or, I'm going to use one more function. Then if you don't understand that function, let it be. Okay, so it's not mandatory to understand now. We have the other concept of built-in functions, right? There we will discuss more about the functions. Then what I will do is here, CDate is one of the function that we have. C stands for converter. So CDate is nothing but convert into date. Convert the value into date type, or convert that variable to date type. Now let's see what happens. What it says there, type mismatch at line number 5. While converting, it is throwing the error to us. This time, date can be given within double quote or within hash also. Any value, you can give any date. Now, that is a date value only, right? It is accepting this time. So like this, if you have any situation where a variable should allow only specific kind of value only, that means only specific type of value only, that variable should allow, then you have some functions like this. CDate is for date. Like this you have for string, and you have for numerics, and you have for empty values, you have for boolean values. Okay, all this. Good. So this is what the data type meant for. Like in VB script we have only one data type, that is called variant, but we never specify saying that that variable is variant. As soon as you declare the variable, the variable will be by default variant only. Then what is this variant? Combination of all the data types. So when a variable is variant, it allows any kind of value, but in certain situations we have to pass only the specific value. That means a variable should allow only the specific value, specific type of values. Then in such cases, then you can convert the variable into subtype by using some functions like that. But I just told only one function, but like this we have some more functions for each data type. Then we will discuss them in built-in functions. Okay, now
Is date everything we need to use CDate to convert?
whenever date you want to use date,
So compulsory.
yeah, of course, because when you are writing the program, right? Before you pass the value to the application, or before you pass the value to the field, first what you need to do is, there is a precondition here. The preconditions are, okay, when I am passing date value, the input must be in date format. Then only pass the value to the field. Otherwise, give the message to the user saying that, okay, in this context only the date value is allowed, but you have passed a wrong value. Please update the value and rerun it. So I mean, you have to give the friendly messages to the user, so that user will be aware of what is the mistake done. Otherwise, if you don't use this, right, if you directly pass the value to the application, your application throws some error which cannot be understood sometimes. Okay, right? You got what I am saying? So in such cases, what you have to do, first verify if the value is in a date value or not. If it is not a date value, give a message. If it is date value, accept it. So this is like, this is one of the error handling technique that what we use. So before we take an action, or before we perform certain action or event, there will, for every action or every event, there will be certain preconditions. So this, when I'm passing the values, the precondition is the value has to be a specific type. I have to validate it. If the value is this, when it is first name, last name, such fields and all, okay, you can pass any value, no problem. But there are like, why I'm taking only DOB, AS, all this, because the values are specific there. Right? So instead of getting the error at application level, first we are checking before we pass the value there, checking, okay, user has passed the right value or not. You got? Yeah. Okay. Now, come to the note what I have told. What is that? Declaration of a variable is not a mandatory activity in the VB script. Sorry? There is a function available to get the today's date. Something called date. There are functions available. Wait for some time. Okay, you will get it in inbuilt functions. All this. We can get past date, future date, all this. Okay. Now, when it comes to this, variable declaration is not a mandatory activity. Let me do one thing. Here, first name I have declared and then I will use it. I am using it. But if I don't declare the variable, what happens? Error is come to, the first name does not exist in the current context. That means the variable whatever I have given there, that variable was not registered in the program. When the variable is, the declaration of a variable is nothing but registering the variable, that's it. So in any of the programming language that whatever we have, every variable that we use in the program, that variable must be registered first. The variable must be declared first. Then only we will be able to use it. If the variable is not declared, then you will not be able to use it. So the same thing happened there. You are trying to assign the value to the first name, but the first name was not declared. Right? So that will not accept. But in VB script, let's see what happens. I remove that declaration line. Now the DOB is declared? No. DOB is not declared. Let's see, will it throw the error or not? As I told, the compilation will not be done before for scripting language. While executing only, it does. But in the programming language, the compilation and all happening so that it is identifying the errors automatically. Is it accepting? Yes, it is accepting. Right? It's showing that today's date there. That is the reason because I use date function. Okay. Now, even though I have not declared the variable DOB, but still my program is accepting that. So that's what I told. In VB script, declaring the variable, you don't need to register first and then use it. In other languages, you must have to register it first. That means you must have to declare it first and then use it. But in VB script, you don't need to register. You can directly start. VB script is sharp enough to create the memory on the spot. Whenever it finds any new variable in the program at any moment, at any line of the code, maybe 100th line, 200th line, or somewhere, anywhere, wherever you have used, whenever it finds a new variable, then on the spot, on the same line, and before that line gets executed, it will immediately create the memory. By default, empty value will be placed into that, and then it will replace, the empty value will be replaced by the value whatever you pass to that variable. So on the spot, as soon as it comes to the 4th line, then it finds a new variable there. There itself it will create a new memory, and then by default empty value will be passed there. Then if you have assigned any value to that variable, that empty value will be replaced with the value whatever you have passed. Got what I am saying here? So like this, in VB script, you don't need to declare the variable. It's not mandatory. You can directly use the variable. This is one advantage. Advantage is when I have too many of the variables, like 50, 60 variables I need to use, then instead of spending too much time of declaring the variable and too much space, I can directly start using those variables. So it saves some lines of code for me, at the same time saves some time for me also, right? It saves some time in declaration. And this is a drawback also. The drawback is here. Now let's say, for example, here, while displaying the value, what I've done is, by mistake, a variable name can be alphanumeric. By mistake, what I did, I misspelled the variable. Let's see what happens now. What it is throwing? Empty value. Why it is throwing empty value? Because as soon as it executed 7th line, the DOB, whatever I have written here, VB script did not consider that I misspelled the variable. If one character varies, then that will be considered as a new variable. Since it is considering that as a new variable, as I told, by default that will be empty value. By default there will be an empty value in the variable. So since that is a new variable, then empty value is displaying there. Since just this is only 3 lines or 4 lines of program, we can easily identify that there is a misspell. But assume that you have written maybe 200 lines of code, and script is executing fine, but at the end you got the wrong output, because in certain places empty values are passed to the application. Then just by looking at the program, you will not be able to understand the spelling mistakes. Even here also, almost if a new person comes and see that, person cannot understand that is a misspelled variable. Right? It's little difficulty. Just by looking at that, people cannot understand. Then again we have to spend a lot of time to understand what's the mistake exactly. Because when we have used more number of variables, when you have written more number of lines of code, then finding out the spelling mistake is not easy. But if we have Word document and all, do the spell check and all, then okay. But there is no spell check and all, nothing there in the programs. So this leads to a lot of confusion. Why the scripts are failing, even though my logic is correct, and even though the values, I'm giving the right values to all the variables, right? And even though I'm using the right conditions and right methods, but still the output is wrong. Why? Because in some of the places you might have misspelled the variable. In other languages that is fine. When you misspell the variable, that will be considered as a new variable and it will throw the error when it is not declared. But in VB script it is not like that. Whenever you misspell the variable, then it will not consider that you have misspelled the variable. It will consider that you have used a new variable there. So when it considers you have used a new variable, then it will pass the empty value to that variable by default. So empty value will be passed to the application, that leads to failure. Got what I am saying? Then what needs to be done here? To avoid such kind of confusions, then I have to ask my VB script saying that whatever the program that I write, whatever the script I write, I have to ask explicitly, I need to ask to my program, say that, hey, don't allow any of the variable when I don't declare it. Okay, so even though that is misspelled or not, in case if any of the variable I have used, maybe I might have displayed or I might have used it somewhere in the program, whatever it is. But if the variable is not declared, then don't allow it. Give me an error directly. You got what I am saying? So my script should not allow any of the variable when it is not declared. Then as I told, by default it will allow. Even though I declare the variable, see here, dim dob, but still see what happens. Empty. Because even though I declared, but still the declaration is not mandatory. Then how can I make the variable declaration is mandatory? Is write down a statement called option explicit. Is a statement we have in the VB script. It's a statement or it's a method. Generally statements are little different from methods. Statements are individual. Methods are applied on the objects usually. Okay? Write an option explicit statement. Very important statement it is. So interview questions are like this. How do you make the variable declaration is mandatory, or what is option explicit? Then when you use option explicit in the program, then it makes the variable declaration is mandatory. Okay, so how do you make the variable declaration is mandatory? By using option explicit. Okay, so whenever you want to make the variable declaration as mandatory in your program, then what you do is, in the beginning of the program, just write as option explicit. So what you are doing is, you are explicitly asking your program, explicitly asking your VB script, saying, okay, don't allow any of the variable when I don't declare it. Not only me, whoever involves in this program, then if anybody uses the variable and which is not declared, then don't allow it. Now let's see what happens. Now variable is undefined, line number 8. So as soon as I misspelled, it's finding. So that clears my confusion. I have misspelled the variable there. But when I don't use option explicit, that will be treated as a new variable, and it was giving the empty value to me. That was leading to confusion. Right? That is the use of option explicit. But that is it's not mandatory to write option explicit. In case if you want to follow the standard. So the standard is, one of the standard is, all the variables must have to be declared. So if you want to make that standard as a necessary to be followed, then what you do, just write option explicit in your script template. In the beginning of the program, just write the option explicit. So that in the remaining lines of code, no variable will be allowed when it is not declared. Okay? So there are some things that you should know about option explicit. We will stop here today. Clear? Whatever we are discussed till now. Let me know if I go a little fast. Again, I'm just asking if you don't understand, because this is the core and this is the base for you to build your programming skill or technical skill. If you fail to understand here itself, then the remaining lines of code, or in the remaining classes, once we complete the code, you can't understand. Okay? What is that? Empty? Okay, empty. No, see, whenever we misspell a variable, and VB script considers that misspelled variable as a new variable. Okay, right. Whenever we misspell a variable, VB script consider that as a misspelled. Whenever, okay, right. So whenever we misspell a variable, VB script consider that as a new variable. Whenever we misspell a variable, VB script consider it as a new variable. And for a new variable, the default value will be passed as empty. For a new variable, default value will be passed as empty. Okay? So just write down it below. So whenever we have used any misspelled variables in the program, instead of passing the right values, it will pass empty values. So this leads to failure of the program, and this leads to lot of confusions. That's what. So to avoid this kind of confusions, to avoid this kind of failures, then we make the variable declaration as mandatory, so that user will be very clear what variables he is using and are there any misspells. Okay, so it's not mandatory to use option explicit, remember, but it's a standard that which we have defined. Okay, so tomorrow we will talk more about the variables, and I told there are types of variables are there. We will discuss them tomorrow. Some standards to be followed when you are making the variables and all. Few things that you must have to remember.